Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next installment in our course. I believe this is Module 9, and we're going to be looking at Chapter 9 in our book and talking about conscience and prudence. Um, as with most of the chapters so far, I think Waddell does a nice job of going over these two kind of very important components of Catholic moral thinking. Conscience and prudence come up quite a bit in discussions and in debates about Catholic moral teaching, and there's a lot of connections between those two things. So this is certainly one of those topics where there's going to be a lot of relevance to many of the contemporary debates going on in the church and in the broader society as well. But again, I think he does a pretty good job. There were just a few things that I wanted to kind of point out and bring to our attention to maybe think about and talk about a little bit more. Um, so the first thing, just to highlight for you, if you hadn't already seen it, on the bottom of page 268, we get sort of a nice summary of what makes up a moral act in sort of traditional natural law theology. So again, I think it's worth recognizing that while Waddell's presentation is definitely not kind of a standard natural law, traditional 101 approach to Catholic morality, it is still kind of woven into his work and his presentation. So if you look at the bottom of that page, a good act is a careful blend of right intention, a keen appreciation of circumstances, foresight about the act's possible consequences, a consideration of alternatives, wisdom about the most fitting means for the good, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it is, we get that basic idea of the act, the intentions, and the circumstances, which is definitely part of his presentation. Um, but shifting again specifically to his focus on conscience, I think he makes a number of really good and important points, right? So a conscience is not just, as he says, it's not something you're just born with, right? That we are born with some sort of moral sense, right? We do have some sort of basic sense of right and wrong, right? And an attraction to what is right and an aversion to what is wrong, right? And so that has to kind of be there from the outset in order for somebody to have sort of a functional conscience. If you had no sense that you ought to do what is right, or if you had no sense that certain actions are right, certain actions are wrong, it would be very difficult to get anywhere in terms of moral living. Right. So everyone's built. Everyone's born kind of with that built in, if you will. But that is not really what we mean by conscience, right? That is just sort of the seed of it, if you will, right? And that a conscience is something that is built up over time, right? So on page like 276, um, he says, in many respects, our conscience is our own creation. This is why we are responsible not only to our conscience, but also for our conscience, right? And so this is an important point, right? Because in Catholic moral teaching, we should always follow our conscience, right? And he emphasizes this in the chapter, right? You always ought to do what you believe you and feel you ought to do, right? So you can't not follow the dictates of your conscience, right? You should always follow them. Now, of course, as he also explains, sometimes a person's conscience can be mistaken or distorted, right? And so some people will feel a certain action is right when in fact it is wrong. Um, Now, this creates a kind of a complicated situation, right? Because then if they genuinely feel that this is the right thing to do and they do it, the act itself is still wrong, right? Because um, just because you believe something is right doesn't make it so. Though you ought to always follow your conscience. So you would be acting in the right insofar as you were following your conscience in the situation. But that doesn't mean that you are sort of morally free from blame then. It's just a sort of a shift in what you are culpable for, right? So in that instance, you're not so much culpable for the specific act that you've committed, since you genuinely felt, believed that it was the right thing, but you are responsible for the malformation of your conscience, right? So, as he explains there, you build up your conscience through a whole host of things. But part of that, of course, is your own deliberate choices over time, right? If you have developed a set of vices that has distorted your conscience, um, then you are responsible for creating that distorted conscience within yourself. So it's analogous to cases where, for example, when someone gets drunk and does something immoral. So if you get drunk and then drive and injure or kill someone, um, the responsibility, the particular act of driving poorly or whatever else you might do under the influence of alcohol or some other substance, the loss of the intellect and free use of the will that comes from that impairment reduces your culpability for that specific action. However, this does not mean you aren't responsible. You are responsible for putting yourself in that situation, right? So um, you are responsible for getting yourself drunk and putting yourself in a position where you are likely to drive and hurt someone else. You are still responsible. It's just a different explanation of specifically what and how you are responsible for the wrong that is done. Right? It's not really a decrease in your moral culpability. It's just you are culpable for creating that situation. Now, of course, you can imagine scenarios where this wouldn't be the case, right? So if somebody had never really drank alcohol before, didn't really understand or have any sense of how it works, and if they drank punch that unbeknownst to them had been spiked, right, where they had no reason to believe that this punch would be alcoholic, they drink a bunch of the punch. They don't really understand kind of what its effects are. They go and drive and get in an accident. In that case, that person would then not really be culpable, right? I mean, maybe once they start feeling disoriented, they should stop driving. But on one level, they are not really responsible for the situation because they didn't choose to get drunk and they didn't choose to get in the accident. They are the victim of someone else's immoral choices. They are the victim of circumstances beyond their control, which is different than somebody who gets themselves drunk and then does something immoral, right? So distorting your conscience through your own free choices over time is going to be like getting yourself drunk. You are still morally responsible for the consequences of that distorted judgment that you use in performing specific acts. Now, of course, as Waddell points out, it is oftentimes more complicated than that, right? That we don't only form our conscience through our own individual choices, right? Our conscience is also shaped by many people outside of us, right? Our conscience is shaped by those who teach us, by those around us, our peers. Our conscience is shaped by our culture. Um, it is not as if everyone who was born in the Civil War era South in the United States um, was somehow deliberately and freely and rationally worse than other people. They were shaped by a culture that distorted their understanding of slavery and racism, right? And so um, that doesn't mean they aren't culpable for those beliefs, for those actions, but certainly their culpability is reduced by their context, right? So there is still a grave evil going on there, but each individual person's share in it is somewhat mitigated by the fact that they are part of this broader culture that has a profound influence on them. But again, of course, there are individuals, even within those kinds of cultures, those sorts of situations, who recognize the truth and have a better formed conscience and are able to um, break free from those influences to have a better understanding of what is actually right and wrong, right? So we are still called to do our best, and that's important to keep in mind. But overall, I think he does a good job of explaining that, explaining conscience, um, and uh, as he notes, right, even Aquinas is going to say, um, quote on page 287, that we ought to die excommunicated rather than violate our conscience. So again, this is not just some sort of modern theological wishy-washiness. We do, in fact, have a moral obligation to follow our conscience to the best of our ability. But along with that, we have a moral obligation to rightly form our conscience to the best of our ability, right? So we should continually strive to better understand what we ought to do, how we ought to live. And so obviously, this is going to put some sort of requirements on it, but it also, as we talked about in the previous chapter, or two chapters ago, this also makes us freer in many ways, right? That the virtues that are going to be constitutive to a well-formed conscience are going to enable us to live better, to live freer, to live more flourishing lives. Now, one of the places where this is going to get a little more interesting in terms of contemporary debates is something he mentions on page 283, right? In the middle paragraph, he says, sometimes doing what is right and good, particularly in certain circumstances, may be other than what a church's teaching strictly suggests. Right? So this is obviously a place where things are going to get quite contested. And if you haven't picked up on this before, or if I haven't mentioned it before, um, when you get into sort of academic discussions of Catholic moral theology, more often than not, many of the arguments are going to center around Humanae Vitae and contraception, right? Really, since its promulgation under Paul VI, that has really been sort of the test case when it comes to a lot of almost all of the debates and different positions in the realm of Catholic moral theology, right? It is obviously a teaching that many theologians, many moral theologians have rejected, and it is a teaching, obviously, that many others kind of vigorously defend and uphold. And so I think Waddell certainly has that in mind when he is making this statement, right? And I do think it's fair to conclude from the way Waddell presents the case that he is open to, at the very least, the idea um, that Catholics don't have to be bound by that teaching. Now, I think that is certainly a highly contestable claim. Um, but we will talk about the details of sexual ethics and sexual morality in an upcoming module, so I don't want to dive into all of that now. For the moment, I will just say it is true that if a person were truly convinced that um, follow rejecting that specific church teaching was what was in fact morally right, then you do have an obligation to follow your conscience. I think the problem that Waddell is, he does note, but I don't think he explores it in sort of the necessary depth, is that we ought to begin with a presumption in favor of church teaching, right? And so we ought to presume that it is correct. And when we find a conflict between our conscience and church teaching, I think the first place to begin would be to assume the error is probably on our part, right? That it is more likely that I, as an individual, am wrong about some particular issue versus sort of the consistent authoritative teaching of the church, which is usually behind most of these kind of uh, high level statements that come out from the Vatican or the bishops or what have you. Now, again, this doesn't mean there aren't cases where people of good conscience can, in fact, disagree. So, those who are appalled by the idea that someone could dissent from Humanae Vitae, um, a lot of times they are part of groups of movements that dissent from other teachings by church authorities, right? So many conservative Catholics, for example, don't accept a lot of the specific teachings in areas of Catholic social teaching or social justice that come from recent popes or bishops' conferences. Now, they would argue that those are areas of prudential judgment, um, but their opponents, of course, argue the same thing when it comes to details of sexual practice or contraception. Again, not to say that they're equivalent, but it is important to recognize that this almost all Catholics will at times find themselves in a tension between their conscience and some specific teachings from the magisterium, from the bishops, from popes. And so, again, I think he does a good job of kind of walking through that. But I would just maybe emphasize a little more strongly than he does a presumption in favor of the church's position and very serious questioning of one's own reasons for dissenting from a specific teaching. Now, there are going to be cases, as he ends the chapter with a more in depth discussion of prudence than we had earlier, um, where we will apply our prudence, right? And there are areas that are properly the realm for prudential judgment. Um, and we do, and I think he does, again, a nice job. I'm not going to repeat all that, walking through all the different components that are part of prudence, right? It's the willingness to be taught, seeking out the counsel of those who are wiser than us, right? There are a lot of different components to it that we ought to employ. Um, but there are many areas, many actions within our life where we do have to use our prudence in order to translate moral principles into specific actions, right? And one of the big ways of framing many, or if not almost all, the big debates in Catholic moral theology today, it's a debate about where the boundaries of prudential judgment are, right? So, for more progressive theologians, for lack of a better term, they will allow a quite wide scope when it comes to prudential judgment about, say, sexual ethics, but relatively little scope for prudential judgment or dissent when it comes to, say, Catholic social teaching. If you go to the conservative or traditionalist side of things, that is flip-flopped. They would say there's very little room for prudential judgment when it comes to sexual ethics or marital use of contraceptives, but they will tend to allow a great deal of prudential judgment when it comes to following teachings about Catholic social teaching or social justice. And so I think without getting into all the details of all those fights, it is worth reflecting on the fact that this might well reflect the biases and tendencies of different people, right? And that we ought to be uh, this ought to prompt a lot of critical reflection on our own reasoning, right? Because it often seems to be prompted by more our own predispositions rather than necessarily an objective analysis of the moral teaching and the situations that we would analyze using our prudence. So, um, again, there's lots of interesting stuff to discuss here. I will ask you about some of your own thoughts on this interplay between conscience and prudence in our discussion, and I look forward to discussing it with you.